Wealth of Nations published, 1776. Adam Smith's work laid the foundation for capitalism. Introduction, a revolutionary economic idea. In 1776, the world saw the publication of a groundbreaking work that would change the course of economic thought forever. Adam Smith, a Scottish economist and philosopher, released his influential book, The Wealth of Nations. This work laid the intellectual foundation for what would later become capitalism and had a profound impact on the development of modern economic systems. At a time when many economies were still operating under mercantilist policies, Smith's ideas challenged traditional views and offered a new perspective on how economies should function. His ideas about free markets, self-interest, and limited government intervention not only reshaped economic thinking but also provided the intellectual framework for the rise of capitalism as the dominant economic system in the Western world. 1. Background: the state of economic thought before Wealth of Nations. Before Smith's work, the prevailing economic theory in Europe was mercantilism. Mercantilist thought held that the wealth of a nation was measured by its stock of precious metals, like gold and silver. According to this system, governments played a crucial role in regulating the economy through protectionist measures, such as tariffs, quotas, and monopolies, in an effort to amass wealth for the state. However, this system often led to inefficiencies, stifling competition and discouraging innovation. As European economies began to evolve and industrialize, questions arose about whether this mercantilist approach was truly benefiting societies or simply maintaining a system of state control that hindered natural economic growth. 2. Key ideas in The Wealth of Nations. The invisible hand, the power of self-interest. One of the most famous and revolutionary ideas introduced by Smith was the concept of the invisible hand. He argued that individuals acting in their own self-interest, while seeking to maximize their own benefit, would unintentionally promote the public good. In other words, by pursuing personal profit, people would contribute to the overall prosperity of society through market transactions. Smith illustrated this with the example of a butcher, baker, and brewer who, motivated by profit, produce goods that others need. Though they work for their own benefit, their actions create goods that satisfy the needs of society. This self-regulating mechanism in the economy, Smith argued, meant that government intervention was often unnecessary and inefficient. The division of labor and productivity. Another key idea Smith explored was the division of labor. He observed that when workers specialize in a specific task, rather than performing a variety of tasks, productivity increases. For example, in a pin factory, if workers focused on a single step in the production process, the total output of pins would increase dramatically. This concept of specialization not only improved efficiency but also led to the growth of industries and the eventual rise of industrialization. The division of labor would later become one of the core principles driving the expansion of factories and mass production in the 19th century. Free markets and competition. Smith was a strong proponent of free markets. He argued that the forces of supply and demand should dictate prices, rather than the state imposing regulations. Competition, Smith believed, was the driving force behind innovation and economic progress. When companies compete to offer the best products at the lowest prices, consumers benefit, and the economy grows. He saw government regulation as a hindrance to the natural workings of the market. Instead, he proposed a system where businesses could operate freely, ensuring that competition led to greater efficiency and better products for consumers. Limited government intervention, the role of the state. Smith did recognize the need for government intervention in certain areas, but he believed that the government's role should be limited to defense, justice, and the maintenance of public infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and schools. Beyond these functions, Smith argued that the market should be left to operate on its own, without interference from the state. This was a radical departure from the mercantilist view, which favored extensive regulation of economic activity. Smith's advocacy for laissez-faire economics, the idea that the government should leave the economy alone, became a foundational principle of capitalism. 3. The impact of the wealth of nations on capitalism. The rise of free market economies. Smith's ideas in The Wealth of Nations laid the intellectual groundwork for the capitalist system. His belief in free markets and competition resonated with the emerging industrial economies of Europe, particularly in Britain and the United States. As the Industrial Revolution gathered momentum, Smith's ideas provided a framework for policies that favored economic growth through private enterprise and market forces. The Industrial Revolution in Britain and the subsequent spread of industrialization across Europe and the United States was fueled by these ideas. In these countries, economic policies were increasingly shaped by Smith's philosophy of minimal government intervention, leading to the rise of capitalist economies focused on individual enterprise, profit, and competition. Influence on political and economic thought. The Wealth of Nations had a profound influence not just on economics, but also on political thought. Smith's ideas were embraced by classical liberals, those who advocated for limited government and individual rights. In Britain, the ideas laid the groundwork for free trade policies and the gradual dismantling of mercantilist systems in favor of open markets. In the United States, Smith's work provided a basis for the development of an economic system focused on entrepreneurship, competition, and market-driven growth. His concepts would become central to American economic policy, influencing leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who championed free trade and the idea of a limited federal government. Shaping modern capitalism and global trade. Smith's advocacy for capitalism, competition, and limited government would shape the future of the global economy. The principles he outlined in The Wealth of Nations are still the foundation of modern capitalist economies, where the forces of supply and demand determine the direction of markets, and where businesses and individuals are free to pursue their economic self-interests. Smith's ideas also paved the way for the development of global trade networks. As nations increasingly embraced free trade, goods and services flowed more freely across borders, contributing to the growth of the global economy. 4. Criticisms and legacy. While Smith's work was revolutionary, it was not without its critics. Some have argued that his ideas failed to account for the negative consequences of unregulated capitalism, such as economic inequality, monopolies, and exploitation of workers. Critics of capitalism, including Karl Marx, would later argue that capitalism inherently leads to class struggle and exploitation. However, despite these criticisms, Smith's work remains a cornerstone of modern economics. His theories of market forces, self-interest, and free trade continue to influence economic thought and policy to this day. Governments around the world still debate the balance between free markets and regulation, but Smith's fundamental ideas about the role of the market in creating wealth continue to shape the way we understand the economy. A legacy of economic freedom. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations is arguably one of the most important economic works ever written. By challenging mercantilist ideas and advocating for free markets, competition, and minimal government intervention, Smith laid the groundwork for the rise of capitalism and the modern economic systems we know today. Smith's ideas helped fuel the Industrial Revolution, shaped global trade, and remain central to capitalist economies around the world. His belief in the invisible hand of the market and the power of self-interest to drive economic prosperity continues to guide economic policy and thought. While there are ongoing debates about the impact of capitalism on inequality and social justice, the core principles set forth in The Wealth of Nations remain a critical part of our understanding of how economies function and grow. Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815 disrupted European economies and trade. Introduction: The rise of Napoleon and his ambitions. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, were a series of conflicts involving Napoleon Bonaparte and a variety of European coalitions. These wars were not just military struggles, they profoundly impacted European economies, trade, and the political landscape of the continent. Napoleon, who rose from being a general to emperor of the French, sought to dominate Europe and spread the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, throughout the continent. But his ambitions led to years of intense warfare that had lasting economic consequences across Europe. 1. The Napoleonic Wars, a timeline of conflict. The wars began in 1803 when Britain declared war on France, after Napoleon became the leader of the French Republic and later Emperor of the French. Initially, France had significant military victories, but the conflict eventually became a multifaceted war involving numerous European powers, including Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Spain. The wars saw a number of shifting alliances as different nations tried to counteract Napoleon's expansion. Napoleon's ultimate aim was to create a French-dominated Europe, but his pursuit of this vision came at a high cost, both in terms of military losses and economic disruption. 2. Economic disruption across Europe. Continental system, economic blockade against Britain. One of Napoleon's most significant economic strategies was the continental system, an attempt to weaken Britain by cutting off its trade with mainland Europe. In 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, which established the continental system, prohibiting European nations from trading with Britain. He believed that cutting off Britain's access to European markets would bankrupt the British economy and force them to negotiate peace. However, the continental system was highly disruptive. While it did hurt British trade, it also backfired on European economies. Many European countries were economically dependent on trade with Britain, and the embargo led to shortages of goods, increased prices, and economic stagnation. Smuggling and illegal trade flourished as nations tried to circumvent the system. Britain, in turn, responded with its naval blockade of Europe, making it difficult for goods to enter or leave the continent without British interference. This further harmed trade, crippled European industries, and destabilized regional economies. Impact on agricultural and industrial production. The wars also led to major disruptions in agriculture and industry across Europe. The constant military campaigns and the movement of troops and supplies damaged farmlands and infrastructure. Countries like Spain, Russia, and Prussia suffered greatly from war-related destruction and harsh winter conditions during Napoleon's invasions. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was particularly devastating. Napoleon's army faced severe logistical challenges, and the harsh Russian winter decimated his forces. However, the retreat left a trail of destruction that severely impacted Russian agriculture and trade. The Russian economy struggled to recover from the war, and its agriculture remained in a state of ruin for years. Additionally, the diversion of resources toward military campaigns hindered industrial growth in many parts of Europe. Industrialization was delayed in countries like France and Germany, as large portions of labor and capital were diverted into supporting the war effort. 3. The shift in European trade routes. Disruption of traditional trade networks. The Napoleonic Wars led to the disruption of traditional trade routes across Europe and beyond. With the British naval blockade, many European countries had limited access to global markets. Additionally, Napoleon's invasions and military campaigns in Spain, Italy, and Russia resulted in the closure of important trade hubs and ports. For example, Spain's Atlantic trade was significantly impacted when Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain in 1808. This caused a collapse in Spanish trade with the Americas, leading to a sharp decline in the flow of silver, sugar, and other important goods into Europe. Countries like Holland and Portugal, both of which had traditionally engaged in overseas trade, also found their economies crippled as Napoleon's forces disrupted their colonial connections. Rise of new economic centers. While the war disrupted many traditional centers of trade, it also prompted economic shifts. Britain, though targeted by Napoleon's efforts, used its naval superiority to strengthen its position as the world's leading trading power. British colonies, especially in the Americas and Asia, became increasingly important for international trade during this period. Meanwhile, neutral nations like the United States saw their economies benefit from European conflict. The war created opportunities for American merchants to trade with both Britain and France, particularly in the context of the Napoleonic Wars and the embargoes placed on Europe. The increased demand for goods, however, would eventually lead to trade tensions between the United States and Britain, contributing to the outbreak of the War of 1812. 4. Social consequences of economic disruption. Economic hardship for ordinary people. The economic upheaval caused by the Napoleonic Wars had severe social consequences. Inflation, scarcity of goods, and rising prices of basic necessities affected the everyday lives of people in occupied territories. Bread riots and unrest were common in many parts of Europe as people struggled to afford food and essential goods. In France, the disruption of trade and the continental system led to increased poverty, unemployment, and social discontent. Napoleon's wars drained the treasury, and while his army expanded, the rest of the population faced rising economic pressures. The suffering of ordinary people contributed to growing disillusionment with Napoleon's regime by the end of the wars. The effect on workers and soldiers. Additionally, the war caused enormous human suffering. Conscription into Napoleon's army required millions of men to fight, and many never returned home. The constant warfare drained human capital as men were sent to fight, leaving behind labor shortages in agriculture and industry. This caused a reduction in productivity, further exacerbating the economic strain. In countries such as France, Prussia, and Spain, soldiers returning from the front lines faced a destroyed economy, a lack of jobs, and a deeply disrupted social order. 5. The aftermath, shifting economic power and recovery. Recovery in France and beyond. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, European economies faced the arduous task of rebuilding. In France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, but the country was in ruins. The Treaty of Paris, 1815, imposed heavy reparations on France, further exacerbating its economic challenges. However, the end of the Napoleonic Wars also allowed European economies to shift from wartime mobilization to peacetime production. Although the trade networks were disrupted during the wars, many countries gradually began to recover, particularly in the wake of industrial advancements. Shifting power dynamics and new trade patterns. The wars also altered the balance of power in Europe. Britain, despite the costs of the war, emerged as the dominant global economic power in the 19th century. Its economic influence grew as it expanded its empire, gaining access to new markets and resources from colonies. On the continent, the wars accelerated industrialization in certain countries, particularly in Britain and Prussia, as nations sought to recover and modernize their economies. The wars also led to the development of new national identities, as countries like Germany and Italy began the process of unification, influenced in part by the Napoleonic conquests. A long-lasting legacy. The Napoleonic Wars were far more than just military conflicts. They disrupted trade, crippled economies, and reshaped the political order in Europe. Napoleon's efforts to dominate Europe through military conquest had lasting effects, not just on the battlefield, but on the economic fabric of the continent. While the wars eventually ended with Napoleon's defeat in 1815, their economic legacy lasted much longer. The disruption of trade, inflation, and social unrest experienced by many European nations during the conflict created conditions for reform and industrialization in the decades that followed. Ultimately, the Napoleonic Wars helped to set the stage for the modern European economy, with its increasing emphasis on industrial production, global trade, and the rise of capitalism, but not without leaving deep scars that would take many years to heal.